Here is the voice of the working class, Rick Smith.
And welcome, brothers, sisters, working class heroes. This is the Rick Smith Show. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today, the big program, lots to get to, lots to talk about. I first want to start off today with, that whole budget thing, budgets being moral documents, budgets showing priorities. And I always find it interesting that the people who tell us how pious they are, how godly, how religious, how Christian they are, tend to pursue budgets that cause more pain and suffering, especially for the downtrodden and the poor. So am I surprised again, and this is again, that the House Freedom Caucus and the Republicans are coming out with what is a really very, very painful budget proposal? And look, working people, you ain't gonna like it because it's you they're coming after. And this is why I keep saying Republicans hate working people. Look at what they do. Not what they say, not the rhetoric, not the messaging machine that's out there promoting all of their good, whatever it is. It's actually what they do. Now, remember, last year, the Republican Study Committee plan, and we talked about this last year, would have cut Social Security by 4% if we'd allowed them, would have cut Medicare by 24%, would have cut Medicaid, CHIP, the dreaded Obamacare, would have cut that by 49%. All other mandatory spending, be it, food assistance, farm subsidies, military, pensions, anti-poverty programs, all of that stuff, they would have slashed that by 60%. And all other spending, veteran spending, veteran health, transportation, education, law enforcement, all of this stuff, they would have cut by 49%. The only thing that got a bump in their budget was a 1% gain for, the military. Because they have to have the messaging. No, we support the military. See, we gave them a little bit. Everybody else took a haircut. Now, this was last year. Understood. No budgets are going to get through and ever again in my lifetime because of how divided we are. But it's interesting that the Republicans put out their priorities. And as I say all the time, budgets are about priorities. It is a moral document. What are we doing? We're going to take money, literally take food out of the mouths of children to give more tax cuts, to enrich the very wealthy. In this twisted mindset that somehow, by doing this, by having all of this wealth accumulating at the top, that somehow it's going to roll downhill. It'll trickle. Where have we heard this? It'll trickle down. You may have heard this before. There's this theory. Maybe you've heard of it. Trickle-down economics. We give a handful of people everything they could possibly want. All of it. And then some. And eventually their pockets get full. Again, eventually their plate overfills. However you want. The cup runneth over. And it then trickles down and we get to fight over the scraps. Problem is, the insatiable appetite for more, the insatiable greed knows no bounds. And this is just duh. I was a kid at the time when I remember, George H.W. Bush saying it's voodoo economics. Because it is this idea that your benevolence is going to trickle down. Get out of here. And we're dumb for thinking that. Well, maybe it's true. Maybe this time in human history, one guy isn't going to steal all the cookies. Now is different because they learned. Again, back to priorities in legislation, back to priorities in budgeting. Republicans showed their hand. Rick Scott, his plan, sunset all programs, everything, all of it. And then we can reauthorize what we think you should have, which means Social Security and Medicare go and never get back. Because remember, the Republican Party was always against those things. Wanted no social safety net whatsoever. Wanted desperate, exploitable workers, cheap labor. You, me, us. So do you think in a Rick Scott world, do you think Social Security, do you think that gets reauthorized? Of course not. Now, I look at the Freedom Caucus plan that just came out. We're gonna get rid of Biden's plan to cap insulin at $35. Sorry, diabetics. They're going to cut again. Now, remember, this is the inflation reduction plan. This is part of Make America Strong and Great. They're going to cut funding for the Border Patrol. Now, remember, all they do is scream about, we need more border wall, head blowing up. Their budget proposal would actually cut 2,000 Customs and Border Patrol agents. But you know what? Never mind. Listen to what they say. Listen to the nonsense jargon. This again, their budget would strengthen drug companies' control over us. So seniors, dig deep because they're coming for you. Massive cuts to the VA. Now remember, they love the soldiers. They love the troops, unless they get sick and need something. And again, this is another one of those moments where not surprising because this is who they are. And I normally come back to there's nothing to see here because this is who they've always been. But they keep telling us time and time and time again by their actions, not by their words, because if you listen to their words, man, utopia. Now I look at Joe Biden's budget. Biden came out with a budget plan, going to raise taxes on rich people. I've been saying we need to do that for a very long time. Going to end tax breaks to outsource jobs and profits. We're going to deal with the tax code. We're going to deal with this in a way that you remember when Mitt Romney was running for president and said, "Oh, I've never seen a company get a tax break to move overseas," only to find out that his Bain Capital actually got it. Never mind what they say. Now I look at Biden's budget, and it's doing a lot of the things that I've been advocating, closing loopholes for these big corporations. How is it that these wildly profitable corporations pay zero in taxes? How is that possible? The fact that he came out with a billionaire's minimum income tax, saying, "Look, we hear from our Republican friends all the time. You need skin in the game." How is it that billionaires don't pay any taxes? Because of how they hide money, how they access income. Only we don't tax it the way they get it. Going to deal with a little bit on stock buybacks, which I think should be much more aggressive. Going to raise the top rate for the highest income, the top income bracket. Not nearly back to the good socialist president Dwight David Eisenhower when it was 92%, but going to bump that up a little bit. And then we're going to spend money investing in the future, invest in children, expand the child tax credit so we don't have as many hungry kids at night. Get more health care for people through the ACA. Look, I would love to see something bigger and better and bolder and more expansive, but it's what we've got for today. Also talking about, hey, how about, here's an idea. Maybe we expand the school year or the schooling from K through 12 to K through 14 so that people can get a community college degree, associate's degree, and have another skill. Because guess what? We're moving into a tech future. He's talking about strengthening Medicare, strengthening Social Security, expanding Medicaid, doing all kinds of things that are going to make your life, my life, working people's lives better. But again, that's what we're told. No, don't do that. That's socialism. And, I lay all this stuff out for a reason, because neither of these budgets are going to pass. Neither of them, on either side, on Biden's side or on the Republican side. There they are. They're telling you what they believe. They're telling you what their moral and what their personal views are. One is, screw you, we want more for the rich, and one saying, hey, how can we be a partner to expand wealth to the working class of this country? We are at a crossroads. Whether you like it or not, this is a crossroads moment. Biden, I got to give him credit. This could be a transformational presidency if we do better going forward. He is moving us in a direction to reshore manufacturing, to change a tax code to tax the very wealthy and use that to invest in the future of our children, of our seniors, of our country. But again, you've got those who don't want that throwing a fit. The wealth class. And they're happy with Washington divided. They're happy with the fact that we're not going to get a budget passed that's going to do any of the things that the president wants to do. They're thrilled with this. Because they continue to rake in the profits. But we're at a crossroads moment, and this is important. You go back to Reagan. Reagan was a massive, massive crossroads moment. And I've said this before. Had Carter won re-election, we'd be much further down the road towards green energy. The solar panels would not have been ripped off immediately. The Patco workers wouldn't have been fired, so union density would be stronger. We would have higher wages in the working class. We would have been moving still in the neoliberal direction. Don't get me wrong. There were some things still happening that Reagan just accelerated, but it would have been at a much slower pace. And working people wouldn't have taken it on the chin as bad as they did. And you go, the Reagan era was horribly transformational. The W years, again, another one of those moments where took over an economy that was thriving. We were on the verge. Think about this. 2000, we were talking about what life would be debt-free no debt. We were talking about Greenspan was saying, we have no idea what this world's going to look like with us having no debt. And now we're, $34 trillion in the hole? Thanks, W. Because, again, we gave massive tax breaks to corporate America and the very wealthy. And, oh, by the way, we got lied into what happened over in Iraq. And then there's the Trump years. Again, more tax handouts to the very wealthy, more deregulation and incivility on steroids. Major transformational change. And I can hear people going, but Rick, why aren't you going after Carter or Clinton or Obama? Because they were less bad than what we were seeing. I mean, I look at Carter. Carter was a very moderate Democrat. He deregulated the trucking and the airline industries and would have probably done some more of that. Not as quickly, not as aggressively, but still we were moving in that direction. I look at Clinton, and Clinton was marginally better than HW. Said, hey, we're going to raise taxes on rich people. What got my vote, he said he was going to fight for a strike replacement bill. That didn't happen. For me, these are those moments. And Obama, his years didn't bring the kind of transformational change that I wanted. So for me, that's where this is at. So this is where my mind goes. The sad reality is it's us. We have to be the ones who stand up and fight back against this. But I want to hear your thoughts. Email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Going to take a quick break. Right back after this. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. We're working people. Come to talk.
We are AFGE, the American Federation of Government Employees. We represent 700,000 federal and D.C. government workers who are the vital threads of the fabric of American life. We support our nation's military. We take care of our nation's veterans. We protect our nation's borders. We respond to our nation's crises and natural disasters. We provide services to our nation's seniors. The American Federation of Government Employees. We work for America.
The phone lines are open. Give Rick a call at 1-866-416-RICK. That's 1-866-416-7425.
We are AFGE, the American Federation of Government Employees. We represent 700,000 federal and D.C. government workers who are the vital threads of the fabric of American life. We support our nation's military. We take care of our nation's veterans. We protect our nation's borders. We respond to our nation's crises and natural disasters. We provide services to our nation's seniors. The American Federation of Government Employees. We work for America.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
Again, I go back to this. We are at this crossroads kind of moment, and elections have consequences. Go back to 80, to 2000, to 2016, consequences. And the working class, again, continued to take it on the chin. It's something to think about as we're moving forward. Let's quick go to the phones. Got Kurt from Akron, Ohio on line one. Kurt, how are we doing today?
Hey, good evening, Rick. How are you?
Good. What's on your mind?
Oh, I was going to say, we could even go as far back as 1968. Just think had Nixon, well, let me just put it this way. Lyndon Johnson, after the three major candidates were declared the nominees, Nixon, Humphrey, and Wallace, Johnson had a conference call with all three major candidates, and you can hear it online too, where he was talking about the bombing halt that he was trying to do with North and South Vietnam. And he was telling Humphrey and Nixon and Wallace what you can and can't say to the people, to the media, whatever. Well, if you remember your history, Nixon went right to the source in Paris and said, kind of like what Reagan said in 1980, or Reagan's people said in 1980, about just hold off on that until after the election. I have a better plan to get the war to end.
Yeah.
So just think, had Nixon not been elected and Humphrey was elected instead, what a better world this would be for working people as well. I mean, Humphrey, go ahead.
No, I'm absolutely right there with you. You keep going. You're hitting it out of the park.
Okay, Humphrey was a champion of the working class, of the working people, just to listen to. In fact, you know that I've done a lot of those historic audio recording collections. I actually did a Hubert Humphrey one. Boy, was he nothing more than pro-worker, pro-union. In fact, he defined what a patriot really is, and that's to use your inheritance, whether it's a good name, a fortune, or just being a United States citizen. You don't exploit that inheritance. You go out and you do something to make it better for people less fortunate than you. But just think, we would be 55 years ahead if we would have elected Hubert Humphrey over Richard Nixon in 1960. And he was pretty close to winning that election. I mean, if you think about it, Humphrey only lost by about, I want to say 0.7% to Nixon that year. So, and then of course Jimmy Carter, you know, if we would have listened to him about the fossil fuels and the gasoline and the oil and started doing the solar panels on the White House, we'd be 45 years ahead of schedule now. And of course Al Gore would have been able to do something with it in 2000 if he were able to assume office. And just think, if Hillary were elected, if she were to assume office, she got the popular vote, folks, we wouldn't have the problem with this pandemic. We wouldn't have closed down the pandemic office. And it's just amazing what a world's paradise this could have been if people would have just paid attention to their history, if they would have just listened and not listened to, say, media just to get the clicks versus finding out the actual news. And you were talking about transitional presidency of Joe Biden. I was listening to FDR the other day, and my goodness, a lot of what FDR did during the Depression era, after 12 years of trickle-down economics, or as they called it, the horse and sparrow theory, this is a lot of what Joe Biden's doing now. And people don't understand this stuff because, oh my gosh, that's 90 years ago. Who cares about 90 years ago? And I'm now hearing women even saying they would rather give up their freedom so that they can pay less than $2 a gallon for gas. So that's where we're at in this world.
It's all about fear. The fear sells, my friend. Fear sells. But I appreciate the thoughts, and you do great work. I hope folks will check out your audio recordings, and I always appreciate when you send it them.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you. Good stuff, Kurt. Thanks so much. No, this is, again, we have these moments throughout history where you go, it's the choices we make at the ballot boxes. And he makes an excellent point. I forgot all about Humphrey, and a true working class hero. And you think about, all of the presidents and their position on kitchen table economics. Carville was right. It's the economy, stupid. Let's go to our tweet of the day. Congressman Burgess Owens tweeted out, "We're holding hearings to examine Joe Biden's unlawful executive action to transfer hundreds of billions of dollars in student debt onto the American taxpayer." Now, if you don't know who Utah Representative Burgess Owens is, he is now the chair, he's the chair of a congressional subcommittee, the Higher Education and Workforce Development Subcommittee. They are holding a hearing this week. It's titled "Breaking the System, Examining the Implications of Biden's Student Loan Policies for Students and Taxpayers." He goes on in a press release to say that Biden's got no authority to do what he's doing, to cancel student loan debt unilaterally. He says debt cannot be canceled, only transferred from those who borrowed to those who did not, creating an off-ramp for responsibility, driving up college costs, disincentivizing real loan reform, and forcing hard-working American taxpayers to pay for someone else's loans is nothing more than a backdoor attempt at free college with abysmal implications for students, taxpayers, and our economy. Now, I'm not going to get into whether we should be having, a discussion around should we have free college or whatnot, because that's not the point here. Not the point. The point is you've got Burgess Owens saying that people not paying their debt is bad. If you borrow money, someone else is going to have to pay for it. Now, again, what this second term Utah congressman, he's been like I said, a very vocal opponent of the student forgiveness program. Argued it was unconstitutional. Said it was inflationary, going to cause inflation to go crazy out of hand. I was going to add billions to our debt. Even signed on to an amicus brief before the Supreme Court. Why is this important? Why am I talking about Burgess in a way that hypes what he's saying? Because we can't create off ramps for responsibility. We can't let these debtors off the hook, says Burgess Owens. You know where this is going, right? You got to know where this is going. The federal records show Burgess Owens filed for bankruptcy 5 times. Let that sink in for a second. The guy who's saying that we can't help college students who were told that this was their only path to the middle class, the only way they were going to have a reasonable life is if they take on all this massive debt, saddle themselves with decades of debt to get this job that hopefully will be able to pay for a decent living and these massive loans so that we could give tax cuts to rich people and bail out banks. A guy who's filed bankruptcy and had his debts forgiven 5, not 1, not 2, not 3 like Trump, not 4, not 4, 5 times. And yet somehow he is opposed to this. It's quite remarkable how this seems to work. Now, and again, I love the argument that's inflationary. We're going to take on this debt and it's going to raise inflation. It's going to be bad. And yet everything that they keep proposing is how we make the working class suffer more, how we hold down wages, how we cause more unemployment, how we make unemployment much more desperate by cutting the number of weeks of unemployment, the money that comes out of unemployment. Doesn't it seem curious that whenever corporate America gets in trouble, whenever they borrow too much, whenever they make bad decisions, Silicon Valley Bank, that there doesn't seem to be the same kind of fire and brimstone. There doesn't seem to be the same kind of anger and vitriol. Or when it's, Burgess Owens, 5 times filed bankruptcy. Here's the thing, Burgess. You can say no when you pay the people that you owe. How about that? Love to hear your thoughts. Email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1947. That was the day President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9835. It is commonly referred to as the Loyalty Order. It required the screening of millions of federal civil servants and applicants. 9835 is considered one of the key preconditions for the rise of the McCarthyite Red Scare. It established a loyalty review board, a master index of those investigated, and definitions determining alleged disloyalty. Disloyalty could mean sedition, espionage, or advocating revolution. It could also mean membership or sympathetic association with movements considered totalitarian, fascist, communist, or subversive. Soon, the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations was published. It amounted to a blacklist. In their book, The 50s, Douglas Miller and Marion Nowak comment, between the launching of his security program in March of 1947 and December of 1952, some 6.6 million persons were investigated. Not a single case of espionage was uncovered, though about 500 persons were dismissed in dubious cases of questionable loyalty. All of this was conducted with secret evidence, secret and often paid informants, and neither judge nor jury. Despite the failure to find subversion, the broad scope of the official Red Hunt gave popular credence to the notion that government was riddled with spies. President Dwight Eisenhower would revoke 9835 with his executive order 10450. But this order dismantled the loyalty boards by transferring power to federal agencies. It also expanded investigations to include those engaged in immoral or disgraceful behavior. This included what is considered sexual deviance and led to the witch hunting and discrimination against gays and lesbians in civil service.
What's wrong with us? Our nation's moral compass, I mean. I don't like being a downer, just focusing on wrongs, but some wrongs stand out as morally abominable, such as this one. It's about hundreds of thousands of our low-income elders who, toward the end of life, when frail and most vulnerable, find themselves cast into a part of the Medicaid system that has been deliberately structured by Congress to subject them to needless deprivations and daily indignities. These are our loved ones with serious health problems who need long-term care in nursing homes, and 2/3 of them rely on Medicaid to cover their costs. To get this benefit, they surrender all of their income, which goes to defray their nursing home expenses. Of course, for a decent existence beyond mere survival, we all rely on a few little things that are basic to our humanity. So Medicare authorizes each state to set a monthly, quote, personal needs allowance so their elderly patients can cover their hygiene and grooming products, a book or CD, a small gift for grandchildren, a chocolate bar, etc. Good. But then Mr. Mingy walked in. In 1987, Congress set the minimum for this allowance at a meager $30 a month, under $8 a week. Congress has not raised it in the 36 years since, and most states still provide only a pittance, despite inflation and monopoly price gouging on practically everything. So our state and national leaders, who freely dole out massive corporate subsidies and tax giveaways to billionaires, are leaving ill seniors with so little spending money that they must ration their toothpaste and scrimp pennies to buy a rare treat from the vending machine. This is Jim Hightower saying, I know this is small in the global scale of human indignities, but that makes it an even bigger moral failure for our society. It would take so little to do so much for so many.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So evidently there was a bomb threat called into a New York courthouse. And my mind went immediately when I saw this. John Barron did it. Go on. Could you see it? Can you see Trump acting again like his other ego, his press secretary or whoever John Barron was? Can you imagine that? Can you see it? I can, because this is great for him. All of this attention, feeding the ego. Like I said yesterday, masterful stroke, coming out and saying he's going to be indicted, putting a timetable to it, putting all the pressure back on this DA. Wow. Look, don't like him, but you gotta recognize the brilliance. At least my thoughts. And that's why I've asked my good friend Joe Walsh to come share some thoughts with us, former Illinois congressman, former 2020 Republican candidate for president, also host of the fabulous podcast, White Flag with Joe Walsh. Joe, buddy, how are you?
Rick, I missed you. Good to be with you.
So what do you make of this? My take is stroke of genius. The one thing that Trump does better than anybody is get attention. He's the hey, look at me guy. I mean, you don't get to be a top reality TV star without being the guy who wants to wear the lampshade. But I wanted to get your thoughts.
This is the beginning. I mean, these next 2 years are going to be filled with probably 2 to 3 Trump indictments, maybe more. Republicans on a daily basis having to defend criminal behavior. And I don't know, Rick, I don't know what Democrats will necessarily do these next 2 years. I really don't. It's going to be all about Trump.
It's all about Trump. And the reality is, I think Biden is doing a great job, and we can argue whether you think so or not. I think, transformationally moving us away from neoliberalism and bringing back manufacturing, talking about a tax code that's going to be beneficial. I mean, there are lots of things that I'm in favor of that getting no press whatsoever because the circus is in town.
And you and I may disagree on plenty of that policy, but I agree with your overall point, Rick. Joe Biden's focused on his job, on what he needs to do. I will say this. Joe Biden also focused on continuing to lead a worldwide coalition to defend Ukraine against the country that invaded Ukraine. So Biden's focused on his job. He's probably going to run again, no doubt. This is going to be a Republican circus. It'll be a Republican circus in the House. You and I knew that once McCarthy became Speaker. Republicans investigating every Democrat alive. But now Trump will take over because he's running for president again, and he's going to be indicted.
Do you think he's going to be indicted by the New York DA, or do you think, as some are saying, maybe the heat has gotten a little too much and he's going to wait for somebody else? Because it seems to be everybody keeps waiting. And this is where, again, I love my left friends who keep saying, all during Trump's presidency, he's going to resign any day now. And I'm saying he's never resigning. Mueller's coming. Mueller was nowhere near. There's all these buildups. It's going to happen. It's going to happen this time. Trust us. And it doesn't happen. Is it going to happen?
No, that's actually really a great point, Rick, because I've always felt the Republicans are the same way. Privately, the last 7 years, Republicans privately have never wanted Donald Trump to be there. They've never wanted Trump to exist, and they've always wanted somebody else to take him out. Mueller, the Justice Department, impeachment, somebody or something else. Look, I don't know the first thing about what's going to happen in New York. I'm keeping my eyes on what I think matters. Donald Trump pressured the head of the elections in Georgia to overthrow the election results in Georgia. Donald Trump incited an insurrection to overthrow an American election. If he's not indicted for those two things, then we're in a heap of trouble.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, I had someone say today, well, it's still a crime. And I go, yeah, it's a crime, but there are much bigger crimes. and I go back to the Clinton years. I wasn't in favor of Clinton even being asked that question while in the White House. And I sex is one thing outside, keep that outside. This is kind of the same thing. And I think average people are going, meh. But what you laid out, the fact that he was trying to influence the vote multiple times, we're finding out. And also, January 6th, you can't get away from. Someone's got to be held accountable. I think that's much bigger.
That goes to the heart of a democracy, right? Never before in American history has a sitting American president lost an election, refused to participate in the peaceful transfer of power, and then did everything he could to lead a violent attempt to overthrow that election. Again, if that's not criminal, nothing is. But don't forget about this, Rick. We learned today, I think even earlier this evening, that when it comes to this whole other investigation, the classified documents down at Mar-a-Lago, the Justice Department believes they've proven that Donald Trump misled his own lawyers when it came to those classified documents. I think he'll be indicted for that as well.
So, but now I've got friends who are saying, no, that's not going to happen because, Biden had them, Pence had them, everybody's got them. They were everywhere. But you hit it on the head. The difference was Biden said, here, evidently we had these. Yeah. Pence went and looked through his files going, us too. The difference was that covering up. That difference was not relinquishing them. And I think you're right. For me, that's the big one as well.
I think, Rick, those are three big ones. I acknowledge that there will be Americans who will not understand the distinctions that you just laid out, and they'll say, Biden, Pence, Trump, Hillary, they all do it. They all keep their documents. No, every case should stand on its own. They're all being investigated. Clearly, Trump purposely took these docs and tried to hide them and obstructed the investigation into where these documents were. Look, again, we're looking at about this next year. I mean, imagine, Rick, you and I speaking in June or July. I think we're looking at a guy who's by then, Donald Trump, will have been indicted 2 or 3 more times.
See, I'm of two
and
different...
he'll still be the Republican Party nominee.
Well, and that's what I want. Look, I want him to be the nominee because I think the only way we as a country can come back together and fight over issues is if he loses at the ballot box. If he goes down because he was indicted, now he's in jail and he doesn't run, or however that goes, if there's an excuse, the base, the extremists, they just go, look, well, we were cheated, and I think things get much worse instead of better. I'm curious what your thought is.
I agree with your premise. I also say this, my good dear friend from Pennsylvania. An indicted Donald Trump will be the Republican Party nominee. Look, and here's the other thing, Rick. I know the Republican Party. It's my former party. I talk to the base every day. The only one right now who has a shot to beat Trump is DeSantis. And the more and more people get to see and hear from him, man, he's got the charisma of your left shoe. Are you wearing shoes right now?
Yes.
Are you wearing shoes? Okay. I don't know what your left shoe looks like, Rick. DeSantis has the charisma of your left shoe. So there's nobody to beat Trump, and the base wants a Trump son of a bitch.
No, and this is where we are, sadly, because I was going to ask you about what your thoughts on DeSantis's his comments to Piers Morgan were about the fact that he got too popular, and that's why Trump turned on him. But clearly, you don't think that much of DeSantis.
I know him. I know him pretty well. Again, he's got zero charisma. He's kind of weird with people. It'll be interesting, Rick. He doesn't know how to do retail politics. He's got a glass jaw. He's thin-skinned. He's not fast on his feet. I don't think he'll wear real well when it comes to people in Iowa, New Hampshire meeting the dude. The one thing, and you said it at the top, about Donald Trump is he is who he is, and he's got charisma. I mean, he is all BS. There's nothing, he's a total phony, but he's a real phony. I mean, he is who he is. And DeSantis doesn't have any of that.
And nothing's ever his fault. Like, for instance, evidently they were doing some prayer thing on this Christian, pro-Trump Christian group, and evidently they had some difficulties. And the first thing he said is, "Well, my phone was hacked by the radical left." And I'm going, you can't just say technology screwed you over. That maybe the Wi-Fi needs to be updated, and maybe we should be investing. Oh, wait a minute, Joe Biden is investing in broadband access. But he couldn't go there. It had to be the radical left. Had to feed the base the red meat.
And Rick, he's not a very nice guy. Trump's kind of a jackass and a jerk, but Trump does it with a twinkle. I mean, he's like a performer. DeSantis just comes across as kind of mean.
Yeah.
And again, I don't think most Americans are going to like that. The base wants a jerk. The base wants a bully. Look, they're my people. The Republican Party base wants a bully. Both Trump and DeSantis are bullies.
Look, I'll be honest with you. I want somebody who's going to fight for me. I've been saying about the Democratic Party for years. In a street fight, they'll maybe be willing to hold your coat.
But not Rick. But again, you get it. Not a bully. I want a fighter.
Yep.
I want a Democrat who will go toe-to-toe in a ring with either one of these guys. But I don't want a bully, somebody who picks on people below him. I don't want you, and I don't want that.
I want somebody punching up, not down. You're absolutely right on this. But again, this view that he speaks to them, and I've said this about my family in the past. They are the basket of deplorables. They were all racist, homophobic, misogynistic, all of those things. Nobody got them to the polls. but Trump. And it's not because of the homophobia or the racism or any of that. It's because he sold them on the idea that he was going to bring jobs back. He was going to bring those union jobs on Brook Park Avenue in Cleveland back and going to give them the lifestyle that they lost because of all of the deindustrialization, all of the horrible trade policies, all of the stuff that destroyed who and what they were about. He sold them on the idea, like a good con man, that he was bringing it all back. Now, he didn't, but they bought it. And now it's gone even further.
No, Rick, you're spot on. He said, I'll bring that coal plant back. He said that. But the other part of that was he told them, I'll build a wall around America and I'll keep all the foreign competition out.
Yeah.
And it'll all be just America. America. Everything will be here. And that world's gone, period. And that world should never come back.
And this is where I go, and this is where I think you and I sitting down and having conversations about policy, I look forward to.
Hey, wait, Rick, what word did you just use?
Policy.
What the hell is that? Oh my God, policy.
Exactly.
That's so cool.
No, because here's the thing, and here's the reality. The reality is Washington doesn't work for average everyday people. We're polarized, and I just went through this. We're polarized in the way that nothing gets done. I looked at the Biden budget. I looked at the Republican Study Committee's budget. No way either one of those are coming anywhere near reality, and that's not good for working people. It's good for corporate America. It's good for bankers. It's good for Wall Street, but it's not good for working people on both sides of the equation.
Agreed. And you and I would disagree. Look, yes, Washington does not work for regular people. I've said this a bunch, Rick, and I think you agree. We are living in a major league populist moment. Trump recognized it. Republicans recognized the populist moment. What are they doing? They're demagoguing it and scaring people and lying to people about it, like I'll bring that plant back to town. But the Democrats, Rick, don't even recognize this populist moment we're in. What the hell? That's where I know. I'm singing your music.
Hello.
I know.
You're listening to the Rick Smith Show here with Joe Walsh, former Illinois congressman, 2020 Republican presidential candidate, host of the fabulous podcast, White Flag with Joe Walsh. You can find that wherever you find your podcasts. We'll get links out on social media how you can get that. I got to get your thoughts because you're a longtime radio host. I know you are. This Pete Santilli guy came out and said that he's ready for executing Obama, Eric Holder, Susan Rice, if he is indicted. Now, you know the right-wing audience. We hear stories of police, they're ready, mobilizing to protect cities. Do you really see this kind of, the militia teams going out with their guns, marching down the streets? Do you see this kind of violence in the event that Trump gets indicted?
First off, that guy should be fired. Like, he should have been fired, a minute after he said what he said. Yes. I do see and worry about violence. I do not see and worry, Rick, about a big event like a January 6th. I worry about more targeted micro-violent events, stealth violent events throughout the country. Remember, we're only at the beginning. Trump may be indicted tomorrow on this New York thing, but I think we're in for a long summer of bigger and more important indictments, and this thing's going to build. And I know the base, I know these people, and there are some wackadoodles in this base. And yeah, there will be more targeted incidents of violence throughout the country.
Any hope of this getting walked back? I mean, because it looks like we're heading towards major conflict. I hear people talking all the time. We're heading towards a civil war. I even know people who are eagerly anticipating this. Is there any walking this back at any point? And does a Trump defeat in 2024 help or make things worse?
Help. Trump losing in 24 would help. Can we walk it back? Look, Rick, I was in Congress 8-9 years ago, and I was talking about a divided country. Maybe America needs a divorce. We need marriage therapy, all the rest. I think we are really divided, super divided. Trump didn't cause the divide. Yeah. He's an ugly product of the divide. And it's much bigger than Donald Trump. The problem, and you know it, Rick, and by the way, you do a great job of talking to anybody. We are so freaking soloed. We're not talking to each other. Yeah, I get it. MAGA is off the rails and crazy, but the left lives in their own world too. And right now, we're like pointing guns at each other. Nobody's talking across these divides.
No, it's important. I mean, if we're gonna say, because you brought up the national divorce, and I got to tell you, I think it's a horrible conversation even to begin having, because it's moving us down that road. It's just a nicer way of saying civil war, in my view.
I agree. I completely agree. But what is it, Rick? And I know you have the most wonderful marriage in the world. I'm on my second marriage, and I love my wife. But when a couple's in trouble, what do? Typically, right at the last resort, they go to therapy. This country needs to talk with each other and listen to each other. We're at that point, and it may be past the point. I don't know if this great experiment can stay together. You don't know that either. But I think we're in for a really bumpy, ugly 10 to 20 years.
Wow. Well, we will see. I had so much more I wanted to get you to, but I got to take a break. Joe, as always, I appreciate the time. Great stuff, my friend. I look forward to coming back again, and I hope in July you'll hook up with us in Chicago at Netroots Nation.
Yes. Love you, Rick Smith. Love you.
Thanks so much, our good friend Joe Walsh. Make sure you check out his podcast, the White Flag with Joe Walsh podcast. We'll get links out on social media how you can take a look at that. Gonna take a quick break. Right back after this. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. We're working people. Come to talk.
The phone lines are open. Give Rick a call at 1-866-416-RICK. That's 1-866-416-7425.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1960. That was the day of the Sharpeville Massacre in South Africa. Black South Africans were required to carry identification documents. These passes limited who could live or work in designated white areas of the country. This restricted black workers from finding employment, especially in urban areas, if they did not have the required pass. Police would patrol the restricted areas looking for and arresting those without documentation. Black residents organized against this restrictive apartheid regime. At the township of Verning, a large crowd gathered, numbering in the thousands. Petrus Tom, a factory worker who had become an organizer for the Metal and Allied Workers Union, described the plans that led up to the demonstration. Inside his factories, workers would wear "Away with the Passes" stickers. They organized at bus stops, urging workers getting off the buses to burn their passes in defiance of the restrictive law. Petrus said it was the strongest campaign I'd ever seen. The organizers called for a demonstration outside the local police station. The plan was to turn themselves in for arrest for refusing to carry the pass. The police fired into the crowd of unarmed protesters, killing 69 people. 200 more were injured. Most of those shot by police were shot in the back as they were trying to flee the gunfire. Thousands of black South Africans were arrested in the days following the protest. Sharpeville became a watershed moment in the anti-apartheid struggle. In 1996, Nelson Mandela chose Sharpeville as the site to sign the country's new constitution. Today is now honored as Human Rights Day in South Africa. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show.
You're listening to The Rick Smith Show, where working people come to talk.
So, I look at this, and again, the reason I like someone like Joe Walsh is, he, again, 2010, 2011, 2012, the time when he was in Congress, and I've told him this, to his face a number of times, I was beating up on him at every opportunity because again, he was on the wrong side of every issue. We would not agree on anything during that time period. Right now, the thing that holds us together, that brings us together, is this idea that defending democracy, defending this incredible experiment. Policy is something that we're not really even talking about. This idea of how to make people's lives better. And Joe and I have had these conversations off air in the past. about our different philosophies on how to get to the same place. And again, my basic belief structure is that we all want the same kind of things. We all want good schools for our kids, safe neighborhoods for our kids to grow up in, good jobs with good wages, job security, health care, all of those things. It's just a matter of what path we take to get there. Do we take the right path or the left path? Do we go along the red line or the blue line? That's not where we are as a country right now. And I think Joe was very clear on that. We're not sure that we're going to be able to hand this wonderful experiment off to our children and grandchildren. Don't know where this is going to take us, because we've got people running for elected office who I don't believe share those values. When someone like Trump is out there saying it's all about him, everything is about him. It's not about the country. It's not walk with me, if you will. I'm looking at this one little tiny thing. This, Christians for Trump group holds a prayer call, which, evidently is now the big thing. And somehow the connection gets screwed up. Who does he blame? Those evil libs. It's the libs who did this. The left has attacked me. Go get them. Instead of saying, it's just technology. It couldn't be his fault. Couldn't be that he dialed the wrong number. Couldn't be that he had it on airplane mode. Who knows? Who knows what really happened? But immediately, it's never him. It's always them. Go get them. It's always division. Even when he was in the White House, you look at his tax bill. What did he do in his tax bill? He punished blue states, specifically the SALT legislation in the tax bill, the state and local tax stuff. Who did he go after? He went after blue states, went after New York, California, New Jersey. Said you can't deduct more than $10,000 in property taxes. And who does that hurt? It hurts working people in those states. But, the rest of the country doesn't get that. They targeted that specifically to punish. And I look at Biden. Biden hasn't done any of that. Now, again, as I've said before, much better guy than I am, because my inclination is, well, you did it to me, I'm going to do it back. And this is why I'm not in politics. But we're in this moment where we can't talk to each other. And look, I've had people that I've talked to for years. We don't talk anymore because it's not about policy anymore. It's about just basic core stuff that used to be in agreement in the past. I listened to a friend going off. Let me say acquaintance. Friend is a bit strong. An acquaintance going off about how Biden is evil, how he's a pedophile, just there's the most vile stuff that they believe. And I called him on it. He said, "Well, you believe the same things about Trump." And I go, "No, I really don't. I don't put him in I don't put him in that. I think he's wrong. I think he's an authoritarian type that I don't want leading a country. I think he's somebody who wants to consolidate power. But do I think he's satanic? Do I think he's a child molester? I'm not saying that. Is it possible? Who knows? I don't know him that well. He did own the Miss Teen USA pageant. There are some interesting comments he's made. But I'm not running around saying that he's this or that. I'm saying his policies are bad. I'm saying what he's going to do to our institutions is bad. What he's doing to our elections is bad. I don't think he should be indicted because of, Kevin McCarthy framed it as, well, we don't go after our political opponents like this. You go after criminals like this. You go after people who broke the law like this. So it's not about politics. It's not about the red hat or the blue hat. It's about the fact that he broke the law. And this for every person. This is where 10 years ago, I think we would have all agreed. Everyone should be held equal in the eyes of the law. That's someplace where we could begin. I want to hear your thoughts. Email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com.
Dear friends, humanity is on thin ice and that ice is melting fast.
Scientists warn the window to avoid dangerous, irreversible warming is rapidly closing. Plus, California hit with 12th major storm as Argentina broils under record-shattering heat.
All of those insane stories and more straight ahead from BradBlog.com. I'm Brad Friedman.
And I'm Desi Doyen.
Stand by for 6 minutes of independent green news, politics, analysis, and snarky comment.
You see, there's a 5,000-mile-long blob of seaweed heading for, it's going to hit the beaches in Florida, and I'm just waiting for DeSantis to say, well, the ocean is too woke.
Won't be long. This is your Green News Report.
It's shocking what fish are learning in their schools.
Okay, Desi Doyen, I thought it was over. Then I thought it was over again. Then I thought it was over again. But it's still not over, is it?
No, it is not. California this week is grappling with its 12th major storm in a row, with another round of widespread flooding, infrastructure damage, and knocking out power to tens of thousands.
You know, in a normal good year, we get maybe 2, maybe 3 of these storms. Now we have 12?
The good news is that the extreme precipitation has begun to ease, but not erase, the state's long-term drought after the driest 3 years ever recorded. Experts say the state's surface water supplies, like reservoirs and rivers, are in good shape, but issues remain for the state's overdrawn groundwater supplies that take years of sufficient rain to refill.
It feels like we have had years of sufficient rain in just the past 2 or 3 months.
And it's still not enough.
Unbelievable.
Argentina is suffering an unprecedented, endless, brutal heat wave that officials say, quote, has no similarities in history. Temperatures have soared to record-shattering levels, causing crops to wither, triggering widespread wildfires, and increasing political pressure in a country already facing an economic crisis. Argentina is a key global supplier of food and is also suffering its worst drought in decades. That has cost at least $14 billion in agricultural losses. Speaking of impacts,
The climate time bomb is ticking. But today's IPCC report is a how-to guide to defuse the climate time bomb.
that was UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on Monday at the release of a major new climate science report by hundreds of scientists with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC report's conclusions are blunt. Burning fossil fuels is threatening human civilization and the stability of life on Earth. Humanity's greenhouse gas emissions have already warmed the planet about 1.2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. We're already seeing widespread adverse impacts, intensifying extreme weather disasters, rapidly rising seas, water scarcity, floods, droughts, heat waves, and more. The report says humanity still has a chance to prevent the most severe consequences of man-made climate change, but that chance is rapidly moving out of reach. But the report offers a blueprint for solutions on how to defuse that climate bomb. It details many actions to adapt to coming climate impacts that are now unavoidable, and the authors are adamant that there are many solutions ready right now to avoid catastrophic warming and prevent further warming by pivoting away from fossil fuels, which will save millions of lives from extreme weather disasters and would deliver immediate benefits in cleaning up pollution. The science panel's report calls for a swift, sharp reduction in fossil fuel use to stay under the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming target and avoid overshooting safer planetary boundaries. That means cutting 60% of greenhouse gas emissions in just 12 years. Guterres also called for an end to new oil and gas exploration. He said wealthy countries should stop using coal, oil, and gas by 2040 and boost funding to help developing countries shift more quickly to clean energy and adapt to impact. And there is good news. Global actions and policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions have so far had an actual, measurable effect on our trajectory. Russia's war on Ukraine forced Europe to accelerate its deployment of renewable energy, demonstrating that a rapid shift is doable. Here's Secretary General Guterres.
This report is a clarion call to massively fast-track climate efforts by every country and every sector and on every time frame. In short, our world needs climate action on all fronts, everything, everywhere, all at once.
So the IPCC finds that faster, sustained emissions cuts by 2035 are feasible, that we have all the technology and tools we need to prevent catastrophic impacts. Doing so will save lives, and pollution benefits would be massive and immediate. Bottom line, the report says, quote, the choices and actions implemented in this decade will have impacts now and for thousands of years.
I don't know how the UN could possibly be any clearer in their warnings year after year after year. The only question is, when are we going to start paying attention to those warnings? And will it be too late by then? For much more on all of these stories and the ones we couldn't get to today, check out our website at greennews.bradblog.com.
Are you tired of think tank approved corporate news and commentary? Are you tired of CEOs telling you what to think, who to hate, and who to vote for? Well, welcome to the Rick Smith Show. We don't take orders from some boardroom, and we don't do focus groups or talking points. We don't work for them, and we never will. I'm Rick Smith, and I work for you. Join us daily at thericksmithshow.com and download the podcast and never miss a minute.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So I got an email from Bruce listening on KTNF in Minneapolis. He wrote, Rick, thanks for bringing up W and Reagan's crimes. It's about time we hold people accountable. He said, I am curious, why do you think this information with Ben Barnes is coming out now? And that was one of the first questions I had. Is why now, after 43 years? Why the cleansing of the soul? Why is this guy who was a powerful operative? Why now? What is it? Because Carter's about to pass? I don't know. But here to shed some light, share some thoughts. I've asked my good friend Greg Palast to come talk with us. Greg is known for his investigative reports at The Guardian and BBC Television. He is the author of the New York Times bestsellers, including The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. Read his article, Reagan's Treason, 2 Bushes and a $23 million Payoff at gregpalast.com, and download for free Palast's BBC film, Bush Family Fortunes. Greg, thanks for taking time for us.
Okay, glad to be with you again, Rick.
I got through it, all of it, word by word. But here's to answer Bruce's question. Why now? Why is it that this guy has chosen this moment in history, 43 years, mind you, why now?
Okay, well, let's let in the people who've just joined us. What happened this week is that the New York Times ran an article, an interview with Ben Barnes, former lieutenant governor of Texas, who said, golly gee, I have something to confess. He's about 86. And he said, now that Jimmy Carter is dying, who's 98, I just want to tell him that, yes, we stole the election from him by he literally was involved in cutting a secret deal with the Iranians to hold those American hostages. Remember, there were 52 American hostages taken by the Iranians from our embassy. I believe 2 died, by the way.
Right.
And Reagan's campaign secretly cut a deal with the Ayatollah Khomeini to hold those hostages for almost an extra year so that Reagan could win the presidency and then he would pay off the Iranians. And he did. It's called Iran-Contra. That is, so what happened is the Iranians agreed secretly with Reagan. And by the way, this is an act of treason. They agreed with Reagan to hold the hostages. The day Reagan took the oath of office, in fact, while he was taking the oath of office, because the Iranians didn't want to take any chances, they watched him put his hand on the Bible, and at that minute, literally in 1981, January 20, they released the 50 hostages.
Yep.
And what did Reagan do in return? He gave them guns and ammunition secretly to the Ayatollah. That giving weapons to an enemy of America is also an act of treason. So Reagan committed a horrible act of treason, literally keeping Americans kidnapped and imprisoned so he could get elected president. And then he paid off the Ayatollah. And now it's coming. So now the question is, why is it coming out now? Why does this guy, Ben Barnes? First of all, the story was originally reported fairly quickly in 80 by the great journalist Bob Perry, who was then fired for his
No, I remember it. I was 13 at the time, and I remember the spectacle and the fact
it's
that
called the October surprise.
Exactly, and they made such a big deal about the fact that the second he put his hand on the Bible, they basically They basically loaded their pants. They were so afraid of what Reagan was going to do. They released everybody in a hurry. That was the message at the time.
So it was the big payoff. Now, why though did Barnes wait till now? The answer is, take a look at a payment he got for $23 million, because this is not the first time Barnes has pulled this stunt. As lieutenant governor, this is very, very important to understand his relationship with the Bushes. And keep in mind, part of the deal is that Bush Sr. is dead, because he also had the information that Bush Sr. was up to his knickers in Iran-Contra.
Sure.
Something that Bush Sr. ducked and weaved and tried to get out of. But that disqualified him for president as well. So Barnes not only covered up for Reagan, helped him get elected, covered up for Bush Sr., helped him get elected. But are you ready for this? This is the same guy, when I did my investigation for BBC, who arranged for George W. Bush, little George, to get into the Texas Air Guard in 1965, to get into the Texas Air Guard to avoid going to Vietnam. So in other words, George W. was a draft dodger. His daddy, Congressman Bush, made the call to Ben Barnes and got Barnes and got Barnes to get his little sonny boy into the Texas Air Guard. Now, you have to understand, when George Bush was allowed into the Air Guard, literally thousands of people were applying for those fighter pilot positions. Almost everyone who applied already knew how to fly a fighter jet, by the way. He was the first person ever to get the job without having any jet flying experience. And he got 25 out of 100, which meant 1 point above too dumb to fly. Also, when he applied, one thing I found out in my investigation, when I was sent there by BBC television and by the Guardian newspapers to Texas, I went to the Texas Air Guard and was able to get inside documents. I can't tell exactly how, but it was George W. Bush's personal application. And in it, he is the only member of the Air Guard, except for his best buddy, Salim bin Laden, who was his best buddy. Only he and bin Laden who said they would not serve in Vietnam. They would not fly in Vietnam. Every other Air Guard pilot, by the way, agreed that they would still continue to fly missions in Vietnam, except for Bush and bin Laden. By the way, yes, that is Osama's brother, but please, I don't want to have 9/11 people say, yeah, that's an inside job. No. Salim bin Laden and Osama were estranged. Now, but I will say there was a problem there, because also we discovered with the BBC, because of the very close personal relationship between the Bushes and the bin Ladens, it made investigation of the bin Laden family very difficult. That doesn't mean 9/11 was an inside job. It just meant it was very hard to uncover facts beforehand. But I want you to know that this is the Ben Barnes who got George into the Air Guard, got him out of Vietnam. Now, why is that important to this story? It's not just a side little cutesy thing, because it's something very important there. It's $23 million. Ben Barnes basically had George W.'s political career in his pocket. He had Bush Sr.'s career in his pocket. He could release this information about the draft dodging and the October surprise and destroy both men like that. So what did he do? Well, Ben Barnes got kicked out as lieutenant governor in a scandal of his own. But then he landed a job with a company called G-Tech as their lobbyist. G-Tech was in hot water. This is where my investigations began for The Guardian and BBC, ironically, because I was investigating G-Tech as the corrupt operator of the British lottery and the Texas lottery. That was their two big lotteries that they operated. They made billions. And but they were removed. They'd been found, they'd been caught trying to corrupt politicians in Texas. So they were disqualified from running the lottery. The lottery was going to be given to another company when the newly elected governor of Texas, and by the way, you know how he got newly elected, Ann Richards, the Democratic governor, running against Bush. She was running for re-election against George W. It was a neck-and-neck race. She knew what Barnes had done. She begged Ben Barnes, please make it public, Bush's draft dodging. He refused. She lost by a squeaker to George W. Bush. And then when G-Tech, when his company was about to be disqualified from the Texas lottery,
he calls in the marker.
Bush and Barnes have a meeting. 2 days after the meeting, suddenly the lottery director is fired The new lottery director comes in and cancels the new contract, gives the contract to Ben Barnes' company, and he gets a $23 million payday. So am I saying that in that meeting, Barnes said, hey, I've got the goods on you, buddy. I'm going to burn you and your daddy from hell to breakfast unless I get my $23 million. They just say, hey, long time no see. Remember the good old days when you were in the Texas Air Guard and Daddy was involved in Iran-Contra? Oh, remember those good old days? Oh, by the way, my client has a little problem with a contract. Can you fix that? You can imagine how it goes. Come on.
Yeah,
we're all grown-ups here. So this guy cashed in on his omerta. Let's be very clear. By the way, he's never denied it to me. He denied it, he claims, in a lawsuit. But that testimony was sealed with a payment. So Ben Barnes, he's not the great hero that the New York Times plays him. Oh, finally, he's unburdening his soul. First of all, so why didn't he unburden it in 1980 and prevent Ronald Reagan from stealing the election? Why didn't he release it in the 1990s and shoot down war hero George W. Bush? Why didn't he release it in 2000 when Gore and Bush, when Gore supposedly lost the presidency by just 537 votes? Why didn't he release it then? By the way, he did admit to the fix, Ben Barnes, the Air Guard, getting George Bush into the Air Guard, but he did that in 2004 after Bush had already been elected. He was feeling very guilty. He was leaned on by a group of veterans who had heard what had happened and read my investigation, and they leaned on him, and he felt so terrible that he agreed to admit to getting little Georgie into the Air Guard and out of Vietnam.
Yeah.
So it's all about the money. So that's what you have to understand. And, he had to wait for George Sr. to die. And I guess he waited, who knows what his condition is. But, I understand he's actually a religious man.
Of course they are.
About his soul.
They do all of these things in the name of religion because they're special. If you've ever read Jeff Charlotte's book about C Street, you know that they're special. No matter how bad they screw things up, they're the chosen ones. So, of course, they're special. But, I look at this, and again, I read the article, and I'm going, this guy's a really powerful guy, was a powerful guy then. They made him out to be a dupe. I didn't know why I was there. Unwittingly, I think was one of the words that was thrown out.
Yes,
exactly
unwittingly.
why he was there.
Unwittingly. Okay, that's the New York Times headline writer, that he was unwittingly involved in Iran in the secret deal to keep Americans hostage. What do you mean unwitting? First of all, this guy was one of the sharpest politicians in America. He was lieutenant governor of Texas. And in Texas, by the way, that position is equal in power to the governor. He was under John Connally. He switched from Democratic to Republican. By the way, Barnes is a Democrat. But because he never switched with Connally. He goes with the governor of Texas. He's lieutenant governor. They both left office, and they're off in the Middle East. For what? And he seems to know all about the phone calls to the future CIA director, Casey, who was campaign manager for Ronald Reagan, who kept saying, have they agreed to hold the hostages? Have they agreed to hold the hostages? So what does he mean, since he heard that phrase, what does he mean that he didn't know why he was there? Yeah. What did he think he was there for? He knew exactly what he was there for, to collect his $23 million.
Yeah, no, so
he knew that he had gold in his pockets.
I go, Greg, I had always, look, this again, I was 13 at the time, and even I knew at the time that there was shenanigans going on because I had heard the story then. Yes. I always thought it was H.W. Bush who was behind all this. I never thought Reagan was all that bright. But H.W., former head of the CIA, all of these connections, this now really kind of puts this all in perspective a little bit better because now we know instead of just speculating. Any of this going to fall back on the H.W. legacy then?
I hope so. I mean, one of the things that's sick about this is, once again, it's pretty clear if you're involved with Ben Barnes. Remember, Herbert Walker Bush was congressman. He dealt with Barnes. He got Barnes to get his son into Vietnam. You think if they weren't talking about the Iran-Contra business? It's clear Bush Sr. was up to his knickers in it. Plus, Casey, who was running Ronald Reagan's campaign, was about to become CIA director. That is, taking taking the job that Herbert Walker Bush had. Come on. So it's clear that Bush Sr. was up to his knickers in this. And don't forget, the reason why they're saying it's unwitting, I'm sure a deal was cut about what they could say about him in advance. Because let's face it, what this guy committed, he was involved in treason. He's involved in a payoff. He was involved in the fix on the air guard. And by the way, that may be also a crime. But for sure, he was involved in this treasonous activity. And treason it is. By the way, just so you know, this is the second October surprise. The first one was very, very similar. That's where they got the idea when Bush was CIA director, which was Nixon. I mean, before Bush became CIA director under Nixon, when Nixon was running for president against Hubert Humphrey, there was a peace agreement, a tentative peace agreement reached with the Vietnamese government of Ho Chi Minh, and the war in Vietnam was about to end. And then Nixon himself got involved through Chiang Kai-shek, getting to the South Vietnamese puppet regime that we had, which had to sign off on any deal and say, oh, don't sign any of these deals because we'll get you a better deal once Nixon is president. So literally that was the same thing. Lyndon Johnson called up Senator Everett Dirksen, who was then had Mitch McConnell's job as head of the Senate, the Republican leader of the Senate. And he told Dirksen, he said, we literally have recordings of Nixon and Nixon's buddies speaking to the South Vietnamese government saying, don't sign the peace agreement, and also trying to tell the North Vietnamese, the Ho Chi Minh, don't sign the peace agreement. You'll get a better deal too if we come in. So the South Vietnamese refused to sign the deal. The war continued. Nixon was elected. 1 million Vietnamese died. Another 22,000 Americans died under Nixon's watch while he dragged it on. So this October surprise game was not invented by Reagan and Bush Sr. Well, it might have been Bush Sr. might have been involved in the first one. We don't know yet. We still have to, I think that those records are going to start opening up. But because where else did they get this idea?
No. So let me, last question I've got for you on this then. How does this help us moving forward? Because, I've said, for years, we never hold any of these criminals accountable. Never. These presidents do these things, and it's always they're out of office. Let sleeping dogs lie. We don't do these. They only do this going after political opponents and third world countries. You got McCarthy right now about Trump saying, we don't go after our political opponents. All that stuff. How does this help us now?
Well, I don't believe in letting sleeping dogs lie, or in this case, lying dogs sleep. I think that it's very, very important that justice be done in this case. And I'm sorry, I think that Ben Barnes, since this treason was just now confirmed, ought to be arrested for one single purpose, to debrief this guy on exactly what happened under oath. This is treason. People died. The wrong guy was elected president. This is dangerous stuff. And the idea that, well, it's so long ago. You mean you spent a long time covering it up and you spent all the money that you got, so now everything's fine. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This should be the beginning of this story, not the end.
I'm right there with you. And as hopefully it continues, love to have you come back.
Well, let me just add one thing. If you want to see a film about it, I did it for BBC television. It's called Bush Family Fortunes. It's about the entire Bush family crime wave, which I did for BBC back in 2003. So
and
Bush
you can
Family
download
Fortunes,
that for free
gregpalace.com. Yeah,
at gregpalace.com. We'll get links out on social media. Greg, as always, great stuff. I look forward to talking to you again real soon.
You got it. Bye.
Our good friend Greg Palast. Again, remember, make sure you check out his website, gregpalast.com. We'll get links out on social media, how you can do that. Going to take a quick break. Right back. Stick around.
We are AFGE, the American Federation of Government Employees. We represent 700,000 federal and D.C. government workers who are the vital threads of the fabric of American life. We support our nation's military. We take care of our nation's veterans. We protect our nation's borders. We respond to our nation's crises and natural disasters. We provide services to our nation's seniors. The American Federation of Government Employees. We work for America.
We are AFGE, the American Federation of Government Employees. We represent 700,000 federal and D.C. government workers who are the vital threads of the fabric of American life. We support our nation's military. We take care of our nation's veterans. We protect our nation's borders. We respond to our nation's crises and natural disasters. We provide services to our nation's seniors. The American Federation of Government Employees. We work for America.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
You know, I got to tell you, listening to Greg talk about this Ben Barnes, and when you start to think about just how deep this guy was in, the contacts that this guy had, the small incestuous pool, this plays right into, the argument that a lot of my right-wing friends, go on. You can't trust any. They're all criminals because we never hold them accountable. I grew up during the Reagan era. I grew up, my political views during all of the stuff that happened during the Reagan era. All of the attacks on working people. Patco was the first thing that really stuck in my mind. And it's one of those things where you go, I know we can play this what if game. What if Nixon isn't elected and we've got Humphrey who continues us down the war on poverty path and strengthens labor rights and strengthens working class ethics and moves us towards being that more perfect union. What happens if Carter's reelected in 1980? Does Patco happen? Do we create the largest billionaire class in the history of humanity at the expense of our national debt? Do we create $32 trillion in debt thanks to Reagan? Reagan started that. We were less than $1 trillion in debt when he took office. And again, you look at these crossroads, these moments of decision. And I'm looking at 2024 as another one of those moments in history that, in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, our kids and grandkids are going to look back on and go, did they make the right choice? Did they make the wrong choice? What if? What if you stuck with Biden's policies of reshoring manufacturing? What if you stuck with Biden's policies of taxing the wealthy a little bit and investing in, wanting to end childhood hunger? What if we moved in these directions to make healthcare more accessible and affordable? What if we did these things instead of going the other direction, which is, pay or die healthcare, moving towards, we're going to have choice of education, which means down the road, you're going to have, well-funded private schools that if you're lucky enough to get in, your kids are going to do well, or you're going to be stuck in underfunded, even more underfunded public schools that are just going to warehouse people. Because that's where we're heading. We're in this moment, and I'm unsettled in a whole bunch of different ways. One, the fact that I don't know in 20 years that we're going to be the constitutionally limited democratic republic that we sit here today kind of like. I don't know that we don't become a fascist nation with an authoritarian president. I can't say that. 10 years ago, with confidence, I could have said, no, that can't happen here. Not us. We're better than that. Even with people we disagree with, we're still better than that. We still agree on democracy. We still agree on the ballot box. I can't say that going forward. And look, the weird thing is, the people I talk to on the right, they can't say it either. It's like we're on the path towards mutually assured destruction. And I talk to people who want to get off, but the trains are coming together. Deregulated trains. Because again, I look at the Republican budget. We're going to cut regulation. We're going to even cut inspections for the trains that we're regulating at the moment. Again, wrong path, wrong policy. Want to hear your thoughts? Email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. If you miss any portion of the program, make sure you grab the podcast. Wherever you find your favorite podcasts, you'll find ours. We'll take a quick break. Right back after this. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. We're working people. Come to talk. I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1960. That was the day of the Sharpeville Massacre in South Africa. Black South Africans were required to carry identification documents. These passes limited who could live or work in designated white areas of the country. This restricted black workers from finding employment, especially in urban areas, if they did not have the required pass. Police would patrol the restricted areas looking for and arresting those without documentation. Black residents organized against this restrictive apartheid regime. At the township of Verning, a large crowd gathered, numbering in the thousands. Petrus Tom, a factory worker who had become an organizer for the Metal and Allied Workers Union, described the plans that led up to the demonstration. Inside his factories, workers would wear "Away with the Passes" stickers. They organized at bus stops, urging workers getting off the buses to burn their passes in defiance of the restrictive law. Petrus said it was the strongest campaign I'd ever seen. The organizers called for a demonstration outside the local police station. The plan was to turn themselves in for arrest for refusing to carry the pass. The police fired into the crowd of unarmed protesters, killing 69 people. 200 more were injured. Most of those shot by police were shot in the back as they were trying to flee the gunfire. Thousands of black South Africans were arrested in the days following the protest. Sharpeville became a watershed moment in the anti-apartheid struggle. In 1996, Nelson Mandela chose Sharpeville as the site to sign the country's new constitution. Today is now honored as Human Rights Day in South Africa. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show.
What's wrong with us? Our nation's moral compass, I mean. I don't like being a downer, just focusing on wrongs, but some wrongs stand out as morally abominable, such as this one. It's about hundreds of thousands of our low-income elders who, toward the end of life, when frail and most vulnerable, find themselves cast into a part of the Medicaid system that has been deliberately structured by Congress to subject them to needless deprivations and daily indignities. These are our loved ones with serious health problems who need long-term care in nursing homes, and 2/3 of them rely on Medicaid to cover their costs. To get this benefit, they surrender all of their income, which goes to defray their nursing home expenses. Of course, for a decent existence beyond mere survival, we all rely on a few little things that are basic to our humanity. So Medicare authorizes each state to set a monthly, quote, personal needs allowance so their elderly patients can cover their hygiene and grooming products, a book or CD, a small gift for grandchildren, a chocolate bar, etc. Good. But then Mr. Mingy walked in. In 1987, Congress set the minimum for this allowance at a meager $30 a month, under $8 a week. Congress has not raised it in the 36 years since, and most states still provide only a pittance, despite inflation and monopoly price gouging on practically everything. So our state and national leaders, who freely dole out massive corporate subsidies and tax giveaways to billionaires, are leaving ill seniors with so little spending money that they must ration their toothpaste and scrimp pennies to buy a rare treat from the vending machine. This is Jim Hightower saying, I know this is small in the global scale of human indignities, but that makes it an even bigger moral failure for our society. It would take so little to do so much for so many.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So, over the weekend, we talked about this yesterday. We found our way up into New England, and stopped by Lawrence, Massachusetts, which was the home of the Bread and Roses strike back in 1912. And we've talked about this. In fact, you've heard a number of our labor history and two that talk about this throughout the year. For me, it was one of those moments where you if you're there, you got to stop because the history just too important, especially in this moment where you've got states like Arkansas, like Iowa, moving on making, well, child labor great again. And, some of the facts and some of the statistics that I grabbed yesterday, the fact that half of the children in the area back in 1912 died before the age of 6. 36% of the people who worked in the mill died before they were 25 years old. And that, most of the people who worked there were young girls, 14 to 18 years old. And of course, there were ones that had falsified documents, birth certificates that were made up to make them look 14. Arkansas doing away with permitting kind of strikes for me. So as I was talking about this, I said, you know what? I got to get the expert to walk us through the 1912 Bread and Roses strike and why today it's so important. That's why I've asked Robert Foran to come talk with us. He's a UMass Lowell Distinguished University Professor of Labor History and Immigration Studies. Robert, thanks for taking time for us.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
So, I'm looking at this moment in history, and I can't help but see similarities today, especially when you're looking at some of the attacks on workers, especially young workers that are going on. I guess this is where my mind went, that there are some similarities. I'm curious if you agree.
I think there are a lot of similarities. The similarities, as you described, with respect to child labor, and there was just news of maybe 2 weeks ago of several meatpacking and food processing plants that were using immigrant workers and were depriving them of wages and safe working conditions. And so there's a repetition of what it was like if you were an immigrant worker in the early 20th century. We see something similar with workers trying to organize Amazon warehouses or Starbucks or, Uber drivers or whatever. There's an upsurge in organizing, and there was a similar sort of upsurge in the early 20th century that ultimately leads to things like the Bread and Roses strike. And it's largely immigrant workers who have been neglected by the traditional American labor movement. And so I see similarities that way as well to today. Lots of immigrant workers, female workers, are just not being organized in the late 19th, early 20th century. The American Federation of Labor is doing well, but they're organizing men, skilled workers. They're not organizing sharecroppers. They're not organizing dock workers, and the industrial workers of the world, the IWW, happens on the scene. And they make it a point to say, we'll represent anybody that works for a living. And starting on the West Coast, they sort of work their way east and ultimately are going to end up in Massachusetts, where there are thousands of immigrant mill workers. And so I feel like there's a similar kind of upsurge that's outside the boundary, so to speak, of what we think of as the more traditional labor movement. The people that are trying to organize, Uber drivers or farm workers or immigrant laborers and such they're outside the mainstream of the labor movement. And they're important also, the same as in early 20th century, because they're pushing the establishment labor movement to the left. The establishment labor movement has to somehow, sort of get off its duff, if you will, and start organizing, or they're going to be left behind. And the IWW represents a similar sort of a threat to the establishment labor movement, if you will, back in the early 20th century.
Yeah, now you brought up that the AFL at the time was predominantly organizing skilled workers. In 1912, the industry, the textile industry up there had pretty much done away with the skilled labor that had, in a decade earlier, was making clothing and making the things. And now you've got all of this immigrant labor coming in, exploitable, dividable, and kind of an assembly line system that doesn't make it as skilled. And again, I look at that, and I'm going, today we're seeing kind of the same kind of dynamics that you saw back then with artificial intelligence. There was just a study done a couple of years ago that said half of the jobs that we currently do will be gone in 10 years, and it's going to be automation doing this, AI doing it, basically de-skilling people. So I'm seeing kind of history repeating itself. Do you see this as well?
Yeah, I mean, we're in the early 20th century. We're sort of in the time of the rise of people like Frederick Taylor and scientific management, and Henry Ford's moving assembly line, and sort of all the efforts to take away worker control on the shop floor. The more skilled the work was, the more likely it was that workers, if they could organize, would be able to inflict some harm on capital, on management. Big Bill Haywood and others had an expression that the brains of the factory were under the worker's cap. And so if you could create technologies that would take the brain out, and so AI is certainly perfect metaphor for the 21st century. If you could take the knowledge that workers had and encapsulate it in something that didn't take a vacation or need to sleep, you could certainly be far better off. And that was definitely what was happening in the early 20th century in the production of cloth and clothing. The more that you could take it out of the hands of a skilled stitcher or cutter or sewer and embody that in a sewing machine or a piece of machinery or a pattern or whatever it would be, you could then just get lots of fresh new immigrants coming into the country and pit them against each other. The factories in Lawrence were famous for sort of dividing workers by language and putting workers next to each other who didn't speak the same language, which would make it harder for people to talk about their working conditions and supervisors and bad treatment and such. They also paid workers differently. So depending on what immigrant group you were from, and there were about 30 different nationalities represented in Lawrence at the time, everybody was paid differently for doing the same work. And so employer would always sort of say, well, you don't want to be like those Italian workers. They're not making as much money as you. You're a good Lithuanian worker. And as long as they could get over by dividing people, and again, that's a similarity to today, making it harder for people to formulate some more mass organizing strategy, they could keep workers divided, and if they're divided, they're weak.
And whenever I talk about this, Robert, this is one of the things that I focus on, that there are always obstacles in organizing campaigns, and none greater than this, when you just brought up 30 different languages that they had to figure out how to overcome to organize people and get everyone on the same page. That's not an easy task, because they didn't have cell phones and the apps that translate. They had to do all this stuff by hand and by people power.
Right. And I mean, the thing about the strike that's fascinating in the research that I've done and other people have done, the commitments were made even before the strike actually happened in January of 1912. In the run-up to it, as workers were organizing around the city in preparation for a potential of a strike, commitments were made that meetings would be translated into multiple languages, that anything that was printed, contract language, demands that were being made, whatever it was, everything would be conducted in all the language representing everybody. So basically, because you had such an immigrant flow into the city, you had so many, what's really fascinating, you had so many workers that were multilingual. And so you had a worker that spoke Italian, but also lived for a time maybe in France and worked in textiles in France before they emigrated to the United States, and they brought both Italian and French with them. And so if they were in a meeting, they would surround, and somebody was speaking from the front of the room in French, a worker who understood French and Italian would gather all the workers around him or her who spoke Italian and be listening to the French and repeating it in Italian. And so you would have all these little sort of meetings within the meeting around the room of this, just this hubbub of languages being spoken so that people could understand each other. And they would even do this outdoors. So the strike is taking place in the middle of the winter. And the biggest meetings had to be held on the Lawrence Common because there wasn't any place big enough to hold thousands of workers. And they would do this outside in the snow and the rain and the ice, and take the time. Right? A meeting's going to take that much longer if I'm talking, but now I wait because I have to make sure somebody else can translate for everybody. It takes longer to do that. And if you're freezing outside, but that was the commitment and people stuck to it.
Yeah, no, it's an incredible thing. So when I hear people complaining about it's so hard to organize today, and it is. Look, our labor laws are broken. It is difficult. The employer holds a lot of the cards. The pendulum has swung. But I go back to this moment. And I go back to this strike and go, look, yeah, they endured much greater obstacles and were able to overcome. So there is a possibility to win these things.
Yeah, and again, they don't have the means of communication that we would have today in terms of cell phones and text messaging and instant messaging and Twitter and whatever else people, TikTok, whatever, stuff that my students understand that I don't want to ever learn about. But they were able to. I mean, the other thing that's fascinating about the strike is the research that people have done. One of the things that survived the strike are all these arrest records of people that were arrested during the strike. And one of the things you see when you go through the arrest records is lots of people who are immigrants from different places in the world are all living, and this is a revelation to historians, are not necessarily, some of them are, but a lot of them aren't necessarily living in immigrant neighborhoods that are strictly French speaking or Italian speaking or Polish speaking. They're living in these tenement blocks where multiple languages are spoken. And we know this because people get arrested. And when you look at it, it's on the same day at the same time, a dozen women get arrested. And when you look at their address, they all live in the same tenement block. So it's clear to us in looking at that they formed an affinity group and they went out to raise hell. And they ended up getting arrested, but they knew each other, they trusted each other, they had the commonalities of their work experience of trying to struggle to raise kids, and all of that made their ability to overcome a language difference that much easier and that much more important to do because they shared such common experiences. And you see this all over the strike. I mean, women lead the strike in a sense of the confrontations with the police, with state security that's brought in to try to crush the strike. And they're getting arrested together. There's a district attorney who talks about women. There's a quote in one of the newspapers that we found that it takes one policeman to arrest 4 men and it takes 4 policemen to arrest 1 woman. It's just like apt for the strike and for the militancy and the passion with which the women engaged in the strike. And again, their ability to overcome their language differences and barriers because of these other commonalities that they had, and again that they ventured out together in solidarity with one another to embark upon whatever the crazy day was in Lawrence during the strike.
You're listening to the Rick Smith Show with Robert Fort. He's a distinguished university professor of labor history and immigration studies at UMass Lowell. We're talking about the Bread and Roses strike from 1912. That name. I know, but explain to people why. How to get the name? Why is that name important? And what can we grab from that today?
Yeah, so it's fascinating because there's no evidence that we've ever been able to find that during the strike anybody ever sort of used that expression or that there was a sign or whatever. There was a labor poet, a worker poet who wrote poetry a lot before the strike even happened. Guy by the name of Robert Oppenheim, and he wrote this poem called Bread and Roses, but he wrote it before the strike even happened. He wrote it in 1911, and he reissued it after the strike happened and said he wrote it about the strike, but it was clearly published in 1911, and so it sat. But then in the 1970s, Mimi Farina and other folk singers and musicians, but I think she was the main person, put the poem to music. And turned Bread and Roses into what became the sort of national anthem of the strike. And there was a move in the 1970s, amongst other things, happened in higher ed to teach labor studies, women's history, and people were looking for these examples that could be utilized, as focal points for rallying to get this history taught. And the poem turned into music became an anthem in a way for the women's movement. And for particularly like the hospital workers organizing in New York City, Hospital Workers Union 1199 had a cultural educational arm of the union, basically called Bread and Roses. And they created a lot of imagery that went with it. and a lot of it sort of came out of that. Then this significant painter, Ralph Fasanella, who was from New York City, started painting what are now quite famous gigantic mural pieces of the history of the strike. He came to Lawrence and sat on the canals gazing at the mill buildings and sort of created these incredible pieces of art. People have seen them around as posters. You might not know it's Ralph Fasanella when you see it, but anybody, involved in labor history at all is going to say, oh yeah, that's what, if they see it, they're going to know it. That's Ralph Fasanella. And then the Village Voice actually sent some reporters to Lawrence, and they started writing, resurrecting history, and sort of out of that came this renewed interest in the history of the strike, celebrating the strike, and I think it sort of, things began to take off from there. But initially, at the 50th anniversary of the strike in the 1960s, we're in the midst of the Cold War. The city of Lawrence doesn't want to commemorate the strike. They commemorate an aspect of the strike, which was the religious church backlash to the strike, something called the God and Country Parade that was held in 1912. And instead of having a commemoration to the strike, they had a commemoration to the God and Country Parade and did it up in true Cold War America fashion with missiles and tanks and parading soldiers. And the history of the strike just disappeared for a really long time. It went underground for generations.
But the idea of bread and roses, the idea of, your labor should get you at least basic needs, but also something a little bit better.
Yes. Yep.
That's an anthem and a battle cry that I think workers today can grab onto. That your labor should get you at least a reasonable standard of living, and then some decent things along the way as well.
Yeah, you shouldn't be living paycheck to paycheck. If you're working your butt off, you shouldn't be faced every other week with economic insecurity, because until you get paid, you can't buy groceries. That's too often the case. And in 1912, the precipitator of the strike was there had been lots and lots of organizing around the country and in Massachusetts too, to shorten the work week, to create a legal shorter work week. And the average work week for factory workers, mill workers in Lawrence, and one of the reasons people were working themselves to death, some of the statistics that you mentioned at the beginning, people working 56 hours a week, and they were barely making a living. And so the Massachusetts legal work week was going to be cut all of 2 hours to 54, starting in January of 1912. This was seen as progressive reform in America in the early 20th century, to go from 56 to 54 hours a week. And the workers were worried that if it went from 56 to 54, their wages would be cut. And they already couldn't make ends meet. And so if they lost 2 hours pay, it's a weird sort of thing where on the one hand, it's seen by some people as a reform, but by workers, it's seen as a threat to their standard, a really serious threat to their standard of living. It might not seem much to us in looking back on it, but it was the marginal difference in people having food. And so workers tried in 1911 throughout most of the year to meet with mill owners and say, are you going to cut our wages? Or are we going to work 54 hours, but for 56 hours pay? And the mill owners wouldn't tell them what they were going to do. And so the workers surmised, well, if it was good news, they'd tell us. So obviously they're going to cut our pay. And so if they cut our pay, we're going to walk off the job. And so they're quietly organizing in 1911, the latter half of 1911, into these language affinity groups and things that we were speaking about a few minutes ago. And basically, it's sort of like a what-if scenario. When the first workers get paid in 1912, if their pay's short, they will walk out, and everybody else, when they get paid, will follow. And so the first workers get paid actually on January 11th in Lawrence. They're Polish women in one of the factories in Lawrence, and they see their pay, and it's short, and they walk out, and they parade around the mills, a pretty compact area in the downtown of Lawrence, yelling up to the windows of all the mills, short pay, all out, short pay, all out. They're yelling it in Polish, and I don't know how to say that in Polish, so I'm not even going to try.
And it's amazing that everyone did come, and it's that kind of story that I think is important. and I hope people will learn from it. But Robert, I appreciate the time. I look forward to having you come back and share some more such fascinating history that I think we don't know enough about. So I'd love to have you come back and share some more
Sure,
thoughts.
anytime. You know how to find me.
Outstanding stuff. Thank you so much, Robert Forant, distinguished university professor of labor history and immigration studies there at UMass Lowell. I got to take a quick break. Right back after this to wrap things up. Stick around. You're listening to the Rick Smith Show. For working people. Have a talk. I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1857. Labor activist Alice Henry was born in Melbourne, Australia. Alice originally went to work as a teacher, but then found her true calling as a journalist. She wrote in support of the day's progressive causes, including care for dependent children, labor reform, and women's rights. Her writings and speeches garnered attention well outside of Australia, and in 1905, she was invited to work for the National Women's Trade Union League of America. The WTUL was an important U.S. women's labor organization, supporting several strikes and advocating for women's suffrage. The League tried to bridge the tensions that often existed between middle-class progressive reformers and working-class women. The League also attempted to build ties with the American Federation of Labor, pushing for the AFL to do more for women workers. Unfortunately, these efforts often went ignored. Alice joined the League office in Chicago, where she again put her pen to work for the causes of women's suffrage and the rights of working people. For 8 years, Alice served as the editor of the women's page of the popular labor paper, the Union Labor Advocate. She served as a lecturer and as a field organizer. Alice advocated that when possible, women form their own unions. She believed that the independent locals would allow women a greater voice than in the male-dominated union movement of the day. In a 1915 essay she wrote, "The meetings of women and girls only draw better attendances, give far more opportunity for all the members to take part in the business, and, beyond all question, form the finest training ground for the women leaders who in considerable numbers are needed so badly in the women's side of the trade union movement today." Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com. Like us on Facebook and follow us on the Twitters at Labor History in 2. Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Check out our website, thericksmithshow.com. Questions, comments, something on your mind, email me, rick at thericksmithshow.com. So I got to tell you, in listening to Robert, which I could talk to him for hours, a fascinating guy, and this era, fascinating. The fact that you could overcome 30 different languages and get people on the same page. Imagine that. Imagine for a moment getting 30 different languages, different ideologies, different life experiences, everybody on the same page. Everybody coming together and saying, we're going to fight for a common goal. Better wages, hours, conditions, respect on the job. And I guess, starvation will do that to you. Because they worked for starvation wages, and they were literally dying before each other's eyes. Brown lung was prevalent, and as I said, when half of the children die before age 6, you got a problem. When 36% of the people who work in the mill die before age of 25, wow, you got a problem. And you wonder where safety regulations come from. You wonder where all this stuff comes from. It comes from horrible tragedy. Robert did hit on something interesting, because one of the conversations we're going to begin having over the next several weeks and months is the idea of, how do we lessen the work week? There's a push for a 4-day work week. The conversation that's not being had with that is, those 4 days going to be paid at 5 days' wages? Are people going to be able to make ends meet? And the reason I thought it was interesting to bring Robert on is a lot of the same dynamics of that strike in 1912 are going to be playing out before us right now. Mechanization, automation's coming, shorter work weeks, all of the things that, and look, the fact that employers have an upper hand because labor is not as strong as they should be, because they've done a great job corporate America has done a great job of dividing us. And maybe we don't have the kind of language barriers that they overcame in 1912, but we've got barriers. The question is, how do we put those down? How do we come together and find that common ground to help each other move forward? If you've got thoughts, I want to hear it. Rick at thericksmithshow.com. If you miss any portion of the program, make sure you grab the podcast. Wherever you get your favorite podcast, you'll find ours. Appreciate you tuning in. Look forward to being back here next time. Thanks for being here.
You've been listening to The Rick Smith Show. Email Rick at rick@thericksmithshow.com. Until next time, this has been The Rick Smith Show, where working people come to talk.